Okay, so it seems that I figured out the problem, and so let's try this again. So week 2 lecture, starting now. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So this week we have 2 readings, the first essay in the McClure and Harris textbook, and the Omi and Winant essay that you can find on Canvas in the module section under week 2. So the essay begins by talking about what the purpose of the book is, and it correlates very much with what the purpose of the course is. So the purpose of both is to acknowledge the racial myths that exist, to debunk racial myths with evidence-based information, and to explore where do these myths come from and why do they last, and finally, to learn to identify these myths and how to question them. She talks about racial myths usually coming from what the authors define as conventional wisdom. And this is the definition that they provide for conventional wisdom: the received body of knowledge informally shared by a group or society that is often unstated, internally inconsistent, and resistant to change. One of the conventional wisdoms the author mentions is the idea that the United States was founded on ideals of freedom and equality. However, excuse me, however, when we look at history closely, we see that freedom and equality is not something that has existed for all people. In another section, she talks about the college experience and racial thinking. And she talks about how the college experience is a time where conventional wisdoms around race are usually challenged. College is usually the time where many students, it's the first time that they're encountering people who are from a variety of different ethnic racial backgrounds than their own. It's usually a time that increases your thinking about race. Usually white students become more aware of their own racial ethnic identity as white. And the lack of previous exposure to issues of race usually results in confusion and misunderstandings when you're on campus and all of a sudden either being engaged in those conversations or being exposed to these differences. And often for white students, it's the first time that they encounter white privilege, which results in feelings of guilt or feeling defensive. So the key pattern, though, that we see here is that there are emotions involved in this experience for everybody, right? People have emotional reactions to learning about race, being confronted about race, having the racial myths that they have come to believe questioned, right? And so it's important to acknowledge and take into account that some of the difficulty comes from those emotions that are stirred for us. The author talks about, 3 reasons why it is so hard to talk about race often, right? Most of our information about race and ethnicity comes from conventional wisdom that is often wrong. Most of that conventional wisdom is handed down to us by people and institutions whose opinions mean a lot to us. So to question those, to challenge those, again, those emotions get stirred of, thinking about, well, what does that mean? Am I being disrespectful to the people and institutions that matter to me? There's also an overall culture of silence when it comes to race. And so we don't learn how to think critically about the conventional wisdom that we have around race. And she really captures the difficulty in having these conversations in the title of the essay, but my mother says it's rude to talk about race, and talks about, silence in relation to that, where, if as a child, for example, you pointed at someone that was different from yourself and said out loud, look at that Black person, or look at that brown person, your mother shushed you, right? Because it was considered, inappropriate or disrespectful or rude, as the title of the essay says, to point those things out. And so what this book and really this course is really inviting you to do is to challenge that idea that it's rude or inappropriate to talk about race, and give you some not just information, but tools and skills so that it's easier to have these conversations. The authors offer a common sociological understanding of race as a social construct. And this is the definition that they provide. Race is a social construct where the assignment of social importance to physical features occurred through social relations, such as migration, conquest, competition for scarce resources, and political challenges against the state. The next reading delves a lot deeper. The Omi and Winant chapter you had to read delves a lot deeper into some of these terms and really teases out a number of concepts that is important for our understanding about what is race, where does it come from, and what kind of social consequences are there as a result of these ideas existing. Michael Omi and Howard Winant are distinguished sociologists in the field. They were one of the first folks to really think about and write about and try to come up with, some kind of explanation, theory, understanding about how race functions in our society, where does it come from, and also understanding it historically. And some of the key questions that they raise are these three questions that I have listed here. If race is socially constructed, how is it constructed? How and why do racial definitions and meanings change over time and place? And what role does race play within the broader social system of our society? Omi and Winant make the assertion that race is a master category and define it as such, a fundamental concept that has profoundly shaped and continues to shape the history, polity, economic structure, and culture of the United States. In this course, we will in particular focus on how race as a master category influences the cultural elements in our society, particularly as seen through the media. So that's sort of going to be the venue through which we're going to explore, and look at some of these ideas and concepts. As a master category, race intersects and influences other categories of division in society, such as class and gender. So they're not trying to suggest that race is more important or that there aren't other variables that are used to divide people in our society, but that race is a category that has been foundational to how we create divisions in the United States. And they provide some examples to the ways in which race intersects with class and gender. For instance, one of the examples discussed are the parallels between the social condition of women and slaves, Thus, they argue that race serves as a template for subordination and oppression of different social groups. It also serves as a template of resistance, seen, for example, in the parallels between the women's movement and the civil rights and Black Power movement of the 1960s and 1970s. The authors also take on or offer us definitions of these three concepts: race, racial formation, and racialization. Race they define as a concept, a representation, or signification of identity that refers to different types of human bodies, to the perceived corporeal and phenotypic markers of difference and the meanings and social practices that are ascribed to these differences. Okay, so race is based on our bodies, right? Our phenotypic markers, and how those markers are used to divide people, and also that certain meanings are ascribed to those different features. Racial formation is defined as the socio-historical process by which racial identities are created, lived out, transformed, and destroyed, right? And so what they are suggesting and really arguing is that race isn't a given, right? Race isn't biological. Race isn't something that you're born with, but that it is something that is formed, right, through a process, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about the different kinds of processes that are used to create races, basically. Or as a reading talked about them as making up people, okay? And then finally, racialization is defined as the extension of racial meaning to a previously racially unclassified relationship, social practice, or group. So as I said, the definitions of racial formation and racialization indicate that race is not something that is given, but that we all come to have race or racial identities as a result of certain processes that have taken place historically, right? That have taken place over time. It also suggests that how a group is racialized can shift over time, where groups that were at some point racialized or marked as white can be racialized as other at other points in history. And one very good example of this is the treatment of Arab Americans and Muslims, particularly after 9/11, right? And the reading talks a little bit about that group itself and how they have petitioned to have their racial category to be redefined in order to capture the fact that that group has come to be racialized as other in our society in this particular historical moment that we're in. Excuse me while I hydrate. Okay, so the article then goes on to really trace where these processes of racialization have come from and sort of where historically they were at one point and where we are now. And really these processes are different ideologies, different ideas around that came to be in order to try to explain why different peoples existed, right, or exist today, right? And there have been different ideologies used, right? So the first process was a religious process where distinctions between races were based on whether they were perceived as capable of being Christian or not. So when Christian Europeans come into contact with Native Americans, they have a crisis of religion, you know, unsure as to whether or where these people fit into their Christian beliefs. Right? By coming to the conclusion that natives and Africans were quote unquote heathens and therefore not part of the same family of man, their slavery and oppression could be rationalized, right? So the rationalization was that indigenous people, African peoples were not human in the same way that white Europeans were human, right? And in a way they were perceived as not being, or not having souls that could be saved, right? The era of enlightenment brought about scientific explanations for racial differences. And this is the next phase that we get into. So this process defined racial differences using scientific ideas around differences of species, where some races were defined as biologically inferior. And this is where we start getting more into those biological definitions about race. This brought about ideas of different racial groups as different species in the human race, where some races were deemed to be biologically inferior and others biologically superior. Of course, the Caucasian race was the one deemed to be superior, which happened to be the race of the scientists who were coming up with these biologically based ideas about race, right? And this image that, excuse me, that you see here is one example of how science was used to justify differences, not just differences between races, but to justify the idea that one race was superior than others. One way in which they did this, which was a huge area of study, was by studying the sizes of the brain, right, of different people, or the sizes of your cranium. And based on those distinctions, saying, well, you know, these people have smaller craniums than white people, and therefore that proves that they're less intelligent, that they can't be logical, and so on and so forth, right? And so this is one example, this image is one example of how those distinctions were made and used. These ideas would survive into the eugenics movement, which was one that believed that the human race could be improved by doing away with those that were perceived as weaker races. This was the idea behind the Nazis' rationale for seeking the extermination of Jews. So these ideas have lasted for quite some time, and we can still find, you know, individuals, people who prescribe to some of these ideas. The final process of racialization that the reading talks about is the political process, which is the process that we find ourselves in still today. As a result of World War II and the atrocities of the Nazi regime in Germany, we as a society moved away from scientific processes of racialization. And like I said, it's not that we have moved, and as the reading discusses, right, it's not that we have completely done away with scientific explanations for racial differences. You know, the reading talks about genetics and genome studies and DNA studies and so on and so forth, and how they can give us a lot of good information, but can also come dangerously close to solidifying certain distinctions between races based on how a genome is interpreted, right? Although, even though, as the other reading mentioned briefly, DNA research has demonstrated that the differences between races is actually very minimal, right? Omi Winant discussed how racial classifications have changed over time in the United States, as well as how these racial classifications dictate rights and status, such as who is free or enslaved, who could marry who has been allowed to enter the country as immigrants, and so on, right? The reading also demonstrates that as these racial classifications have also been used in order to identify who has been discriminated in order to make corrections, right? So it can be, so to speak, used for good or evil, right? And to identify marginalized groups and how they've been discriminated in order to defend and find political usefulness for racial classifications. So while on the one hand, racial classifications have often been used by the state, by the government to create divisions amongst us, it has also served as a tool for marginalized groups, as a way to speak back to the government about the ways in which they're othered, about the ways that they're discriminated against, in order to seek rights and rectifications, right? Well, and another point that I've already mentioned was the example of Arab Americans who have also petitioned to have themselves reclassified. So this political process is our state processes for creating racial classifications. Racial classifications dictate rights and status in a society. They also have provided certain protections for marginalized groups, as I mentioned. But yet still, there's some limitations to that, right? Marginalized groups' ability to control how they're racially classified is often denied by the state's racial classification system. And in our day and age, the big racial classification system is the census, right? And when you look at the history of the census, the reading talks a little bit about how the categories in the sense, the racial categories in the census have changed over time, and also how different those classifications are in terms of their definitions. So how did you get to be included, right? The reading talked about how, African Americans are defined as people whose ancestry comes from Africa. And then there's, whereas for Latinos, they're not even classified as a race. They're just classified as an ethnicity that could be part of any one of the different races under the racial categories, right? And then you have indigenous people in that category, which requires that they show some proof, right? That they are part of or members of a particular tribe, right? So the definitions, the qualifications for each racial category are also different, right? But also the reading mentions how in the census, if you what you mark on the census doesn't always stay that way, right? And how particularly when it comes to mixed race folks, how even if they're trying to mark multiple boxes or try to make the thing really represent how they identify themselves, that the system itself will just accept one box that is marked, right? Or give primacy to one particular type of box versus another. And this isn't always just taking place in a tool like the census, right? This happens in people's everyday interactions. And to give you a concrete example, I had this issue with my daughter. I think I mentioned in my introductory video, I have a daughter who's in college right now, just like you guys. And when she was in high school, you might remember at the beginning of every school year, there are all these pieces of paper that you're supposed to fill out. And in one of those pieces of paper, her race was asked to be identified. And so I would always mark her as Hispanic or Latino or whatever the particular classification was, and marked multiple boxes under race. And so one time after submitting this, going through all of that to make it as clear as possible what her appropriate racial classification should be in school, I later find out that she's been marked as white in the school's own system. So I had to constantly correct that part every school year for her. So it's not just in the census, right? Here is a school system. Here's a particular school that whoever is doing the intake in the office looked at what I had marked and decided that where she fell was really under white. Even though if you saw my child, there is no way that anyone would ever think of her as white, right? That sometimes she gets mistaken for South Asian, but never for white. So this is just to give you sort of another anecdotal, right, example of how this process, right, of racial classification is lived, right, is experienced in our everyday lives. The next concept that Omi and Winant talk about, and is one of the concepts that they're most known for, is this idea of racial projects. And racial projects are defined as simultaneously an interpretation, representation, or explanation of racial identities and meanings, and in efforts to organize and distribute resources along particular racial lines. In the previous essay in the textbook, she talked about the idea that we are ideas such as, the fact that we are post-racial or color blindness as examples of racial projects. So how do these beliefs impact how we, as this says in the quote, reorganize or redistribute resources along racial lines? Well, for example, if we can convince ourselves that race doesn't matter in the way that it used to, right, that we're post-racial, or, we don't see color anymore, we don't need to see color anymore, that like during the time of segregation, then that means that we no longer have to invest in offices like the Equal Opportunity Commission, because presumably there is no more discrimination, right? Because we're post-racial. And so we don't have to keep track of any forms of discrimination or try to correct them, because they really aren't existing. And if they are existing, it's not that often, right? That would be sort of the idea behind believing that we're post-racial, right? But that would be an example of how the idea of being post-racial is a racial project, right? And these would be the types of results that could come from that kind of racial project. Racial projects can be carried out at the systemic level, but they can also be carried out at the individual everyday level, right? And the reading talked about that and gave you some examples of that. Racial projects can serve to uphold racial divisions, but they can also be projects to undermine or reject racial divisions, like some of the recent anti-racism projects, right, that we've seen in the last couple of years. The reading also defines racism and how, what do racial projects that are racist look like, right? So racial projects can be deemed as racist if it creates or reproduces structures of domination based on racial significations and identities. Racism at times is only limited to racial hatred, and the reading talked about how often we don't consider something racist unless it's that kind of racially violent forms of hatred that are expressed. Racism as racial hatred definition is a narrow interpretation, missing systemic and institutional forms of racism. And also they argue that racism often takes on more subtle forms. Racial projects that are racist can also be carried out by people of color, and this is important to note, against each other, right? So that racial projects, it isn't always, you know, racial projects that are racist are racial projects by white folks, and racial projects that are anti-racist are projects that are only by people of color, right? The reading makes very clear that that is not what they're suggesting. They also talk about, in terms of subtle forms of racism, that they often are implicit, deniable, and unconscious. The final section of the article talks about historical racial politics in the United States, right? And sort of the different racial forms of politics that we've had. The first kind defined has certain consequences. And this is the time period where the government is actively treating non-whites as second-class citizens and preventing their participation in democracy. This period has had three important consequences in American society that we still see today. American comes to be identified as white. It organized the color line, creating racial divisions as fundamental to our society. And it's also resulted in the consolidation of opposition and resistance by excluded and marginalized groups. The reading talks about how more recently, right, and in the time period that we're in now, is in the time period of racial democracy, of trying to create a racial democracy. This thing is seen in the efforts to include racial others in participating in democracy, like, for example, the civil rights laws that were passed decades ago. But they also make the point, right, that this process, right, that we're in of achieving a racial democracy is not complete, right? And we see that in more recent attempts by different states, for example, to pass laws that are disenfranchising some marginalized groups, right, making it more difficult for certain folks to be able to cast their ballots, to vote on election day, to qualify for being able to vote, right, in their states. And the two images here I thought were significant and relevant, because in the top one, it's comes from the civil rights era, right, and the marches that they had asking for voting rights. The image on the bottom is from more recently, from the recent protests and marches and so on, fighting for voting rights, right? Or trying to protect the rights that people have, right? The rights that people made sacrifices and died for, right? Marching, as we see in the first picture from that time period. So this is where we are now, is what the reading is suggesting, that we are in this process of trying to create a racial democracy, but that it isn't easy, as we've seen, right? And that this larger history that they've provided is the context to help us understand why we are where we are at this moment, right? So these are some of the terms that we need to understand that help us understand a little bit about race and how it's come to be defined as it is today, and why it has the kinds of impact that it has still to this day, and that we will continue to discuss as we get further and further into the semester and start really looking at how do these things get perpetuated through the media, okay, and through the different kinds of stereotypes, myths, right, that are represented through the media about different racial and ethnic groups. So this is where we end this week. I will, as I mentioned before, put up the discussion cafe. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts and any questions you have about the reading material or the lecture. And again, don't forget about your papers due Sunday, and I will see you next week. Take care.